my name badge these days. And I've got a new collection I can go and get soon. That's if I join DEPI. But what it says is I've largely been doing the same job for a bit over 20 years, and I've worked for a number of different organisations. But Barmah's really grabbed me. I grew up near Ferntree Gully, and the Red Gum Forest was a place where I just used to visit for camping. And when a job went where I could look at the ecology of the forest, I jumped at the opportunity. That was back in 1990. So just as a brief introduction to the site, I mean, if you don't know where it is, I mean, where have you been? And got a good weekend coming up. I'd pack the swag and head that way. But essentially, it's between Deniliquin, Barmah Township or Echuca, and Toke. And it's had a geological uplift that occurred about 20,000 years ago and actually blocked the direction of the Murray River. And that's why it's fanned out where it is. And it's the largest river red gum forest in Australia as one big floodplain unit. Everyone says their spot's a biological hotspot, so I'll say the same. Essentially, if you've got a large ecosystem with a range of habitat types, box woodlands, floodplains, etc., you're going to get a fair chance of getting a very high diversity. And Barmah has just that. It's been a site of Aboriginal significance, as you could imagine. These were places where the Aboriginal tribes of 20,000 years ago and longer, 40 at least from Cow Swamp, would be or wouldn't have to be nomadic as they do in dry areas, because you had basically year-round supply of food and resources at this site. Of course, this is the same thing that's attracted the Europeans in the very early 1800s with cattle grazing and sheep grazing, and of course with the timber cutting that followed. And these are all things that have shaped the forest that we see today, particularly the volumes of logs that were taken out and the change in structure of this floodplain. But it's also a Ramsar listed site in recognition of the number of water birds that are found there. Migratory water birds don't find the site to their liking as they do with the big intertidal mudflats. But we do get some of these, such as sharp-tailed sandpipers from Siberia. Otherwise, it's a Ramsar site because of the percentage of different water birds of the population that breed there. It's also a site where people like to go camping and get close to the river. But it is the river that drives the story of Barmah-Millewa. It's because of the very low banks of the Murray. You can see here, during a summer irrigation season, the banks are barely above the water. And that's because it's the narrowest capacity of the Murray, anywhere between Hume Dam and the ocean, over 2,000 kilometres away. So whatever the Murray-Darling Basin Commission can deliver water down through the Barmah choke, it can get for downstream water diversion. So the choke is a constraining point. But it's also a throttle that allows the floods to flood out onto the floodplain relatively easy, compared with downstream sites where they have to get the river so elevated to get onto the floodplain that things like pumping becomes the only option of flooding. In terms of change in hydrology, this chart, it's a calendar year, January to December. This line represents the channel capacity of the Murray. Anything above that, it'll flow into the forest if we don't open regulators. And that line up here is how high the river really should get before it actually puts substantial depth on the floodplains. We can see under the natural situation, the site would have dried out every summer and autumn and then flooded quite deeply in winter and spring. But with river regulation, you can see that we've had a little bit of a reversal of that situation. The significance here is the river is run within an inch of the river channel capacity right through the summer irrigation season. If it rains at any stage during that delivery, because it takes about 6 days to get from Hume down to Barmah, irrigators cancel their water orders, and the excess water in a river breaks the banks. So that's a significant issue that we'll talk about, is these so-called rain rejection events. Otherwise, the timing of our floods that still occur is still largely spring-based, so it's a good thing. This horrendogram, this is the natural flooding. Every line is a year. This is the current. Basically, the blue is representing a fairly good flood in that particular month, and you can see just from the spots that we've had a fairly vast change. Of significance is some of these gaps of years between a really good flood. In cross-section of the floodplain, it's basically the high winter-spring floods are becoming reduced, and the fairly low summer-autumn floods are increasing. So on a floodplain, in terms of vegetation zonation, the River Red Gum is actually finding the sites drier where it was previously too wet for it to establish. So they're marching down onto the floodplain. Conversely, the giant rush is finding there's other areas where it can now colonise because of these tiny little shallow floods that keep wetting up the floodplain. Interestingly, both are indigenous species for the floodplain, red gum and giant rush, or Juncus ingens. And it's this change in zonation, it's at the expense of the Moragrass plains. Now, in reality, these plains are big, vast, open treeless systems in the forest. You know, multiple times the MCG, that will regularly flood to a couple of metres deep. And then they're dominated by a floodplain grass called moragrass or spiny mudgrass, Pseudoraphis spinescens. It grows to 4 metres in length. It can grow nearly an inch a day. I mean, this thing rockets along, and when the floods subside, basically it collapses and the trails across the mud flats re-establishes and turns into a dry phase. A lot of water birds feed there, and it's a tremendous area. It also shares that habitat with a dozen or a couple of dozen of other species. So it's floristically rich, and the change in species composition, depending on the flood phase, is really interesting. But with the change, and also with the droughts, which is proposed to increase, means that the depth of flooding is no longer occurring in both times, and we're getting systems drying out for the first time, basically any time in recorded history, because they're not getting filled up every second year. And what's happening is the giant rush has found its new mark up on a floodplain, but it's also extending down. So it's vastly increasing its area that it can colonise. And once it colonises, it tends to dominate. It grows to 3 to 4 metres in height. So it's quite a formidable structural dominant. Red gum are advancing further down as well. And once they become established, the depth of the flooding is no longer a controlling factor. It's more the duration. So it's really starting to obliterate the forest. And Professor Leon Bren had modelled this 20 years ago, and it indicated that the red gums are going to take over within 100 years. But with the giant rush, it's probably going to be 50 years. And what we're observing is really alarming since then, which I'll show in a minute. In fact, I'll show you right now. This is the trend of moragrass that's just been remapped by CSIRO. And it's showing there's not a lot left. And it could be that the drought phase we've just come through has been so severe, it's severely weakened it. And then we had 2.5 years of nearly continuous flooding. If you recall, in March, I think we've been having these huge flood peaks, which just when the floodplains have been drying, they've been re-wetted. Breaks the drought cycle of the moragrass, and its health isn't looking great. So in terms of a brief history of our management, back in the 50s, I guess, the regulators were constructed following Hume Dam's completion in the late 30s. And that was basically to prevent water from being lost to the swamps. Whereas now we can actually use those for good instead of evil. We've subsequently built some secondary regulators by removing block banks from the old forestry days, and even smaller ones again, the little tertiary regulators. And we tried to use those in varying combinations for water management. So they threw me into the wetlands, and we had an experimental pond situation. In fact, some of you in the audience probably remember going out and visiting and working around these areas where we had 3 replicates and we're trying to flood them at different times to see what moira grass liked to grow. And, well, we got it to grow. We had some confounding problems with the flooding that occurred that year, which is really high and overtopped the embankment. But basically we knew how to grow grass, and there it was. But a side issue when we're doing this work was more on the outside of the fence of our plots. Here we didn't have a lot of moira grass, but inside the plots, which at best could be grazing reduced because kangaroos would still get in there and have a field day, was the impact of cattle grazing. And these impacts were residual, as it turned out, until we pulled up the fences and went home when the funds ran out. And the same here again. Again, quite a residual effect. So it obviously wasn't helping the moira grass's cause by having continual grazing, even though the grazing wasn't out there at that particular time. So cattle like to eat grass. They don't like to eat giant rush or river red gum or to eat culm sedge or the other vast majorities of the understory within the forest, but they hammer the moira grass plains. And so do another animal. And we've got a number of feral horses, or I'm supposed to call them wild horses. I'm not allowed to call them feral horses now. We have a wild horse management plan that's gone out for public comment, and the idea was to basically remove 100% removal of horses from the forest. But yeah, the decision has been made by the current government to basically have the status quo at the moment because some people like them. But another important part of history was the development of the Barmah-Millewa Forum. So this was a community and agency forum that was convened by the Murray Basin Authority, who have invested vast resources into the management of Barmah-Millewa Forest over the 25 years at least. And that had a number of significant outputs over the course of its 10 years or so. Some of it was identifying some issues that were going on in the forest that previously we never had funding for. And yet as a community group with the agencies and the decision makers at the time, we were getting $500,000 per year at the direction of this community group who could nearly make decisions on the spot. It was just wonderful. A lot of it went into on-ground works or plans, such as a fishway that we were wanting to put around one of the major regulators in the forest. But of significance was the environmental water. Barmah-Millewa got its own environmental water, and it was a substantial volume, 100 gigalitres. Thinking 1 megalitre is 1 million litres. Well, this is 1,000 million litres for 1 gig, but we had 100 of them given every year, and it seemed enormous. And then a few years on, we were given an extra 50 gigalitres of lower security water, but we could accumulate it over years, whereas now that's standard practice within irrigation water, but it wasn't back then. It was really breaking ground. And we could accumulate it up to 700 gigalitres, and it seemed enormous. But even when we first used it, which was in 1998, and we used about 100 gigalitres of it, it's prior to us accumulating it, it showed it's a really big floodplain, and 100 gigalitres doesn't go far. For example, it could elevate the river a little bit, but for about 10 days, whereas we need it for about 4 months to achieve a lot of the environmental imperatives. So we've got this amazing accounting system, but it's a U-Butte one. We then got into a period where we had, again, many of you might have been directly involved with this, the Murray Flow Assessment Tool. So MDBA were looking at, well, how much water does the environment need? And because it's not just Barmah sitting on the floodplain, we've got other significant floodplain environments further downstream and upstream. So a lot of the data and research was gathered, and whatever anyone had was put into these things to develop up models to work out how much water was needed. And then came along the Living Murray program, and we were bestowed with the stone tablets of the objectives that we were going to achieve, and then basically left to our devices to say, well, this is essentially the big broad aims. You go and refine them. So a myriad of plans were written. We had refined objectives where we tried to include other things such as frogs and turtles. We didn't have insects, but we had a range of other things there. And then it got down to some serious environmental watering. And 2005, I think, was really quite significant. It's where we tried a whole range of different water management options that we hadn't done in the past. This is the hydrograph, the height of the Murray River between June to December in 2005. So the last half a year. And again, that brown line represents channel capacity. So once the river exceeds that, it's flooding out onto the floodplain. Come August to September, so late winter, early spring, we had some natural flood peaks. Largely they'd be driven by flows in the Ovens River system, which is the absolute bread and butter of flooding for Barmah-Millewa, and I hope they never dam it, because when you get a good rainfall there, it basically transfers straight down to the river. It's only later, after Hume tends to fill and spill, that we get sustained and quite large flows. But here, where the red line is, represents how the river would have behaved had we not had environmental water. So in other words, the difference between the red line and the blue line is us filling up the river with environmental water. And we built on flood peaks, which was really significant when you think about it, because we're actually elevating the height of the river on purpose, and depending on how high we get that, we could potentially have impacts on private land. And we had some minor impacts, and MDBA actually paid some retrospective compensation in those instances. But what we managed to do was to keep the river elevated out of the river onto the floodplain continuously for this whole time. And there would have been 1, 2, 3, 4 big excuses for waterbirds to have packed up and gone home. And what they do is they basically abort their nesting attempt. And you could have 10,000 waterbirds sitting out there in 3 or 4 eggs each, or in chick stage. And if the water drops, they just say, "See you later, we're going." And it's not a good look. And particularly when we're talking about orders of magnitude decrease in waterbird numbers breeding in the forest over the years, I think it's imperative that we've really got to try to nurse these things through where river regulation is causing the problem. And of course, that's most years. Interestingly, this green line represents how the river would have behaved in that particular year had we not had any water extraction or dams and weirs. So straight away you can see it would have been yet another year that the natural flood regime would have got substantial waterbird numbers through. So really what we're doing with the small amount of environmental water is just plugging in parts of the hydrograph that are severely missing that we're aware of, and that's an important thing, where we can play with. The other interesting thing is Barmah floodplain is a shedding floodplain. It's very flat. It's basically like a billiard table with a pack of cards under 2 legs. And to flood it, you start off at the high end and it runs down and gets back into the river. And about 95% of that water actually gets straight back into the Murray River. So, and it's that floodplain riverine connectivity, which I think we need to protect, because that's what's feeding the river. And the world over has divorced their floodplains from rivers. And I think Barmah-Millewa is this tremendous opportunity where we can keep that connection. And Moira grass went gangbusters that particular year. And I had darker hair. This trace is basically 100 years of data, a bit more, 105, of whatever the height of the Murray was in those particular years. And what instantly stands out is just how severe this so-called Millennium drought has been. Particularly the last 5 years after 2005, when we had the environmental water, which probably gave it even more significance than what we had. We had some of the best waterbird breeding events for 40 years. And for brolgas, it was 60 years. But then we had 5 years of nothing, and permanent water bodies actually dried up, and the creeks dried up. We lost substantial tracts of forests. It was so stressed that they basically died. They're on the outer side of the floodplain. And some permanent waterways, which, when we look at the trace, probably haven't ever dried up. So we scrambled to get environmental water for the last refuges that were existing out there. And of course, that takes time, but to give all the government agencies credit, they worked very quickly and we got approval to release water. Probably too late for some sites and some things that we found wandering around the bush. This is from that waterhole. But it was probably that boost that we needed. Like we had a good, healthy environment right up to 2005, and that probably nursed a number of things through that drought of 5 years. But our modelling indicates that 5 years isn't going to be the longest drought. The other significance was the colonisation of giant rush on Barmah Lake. And this was a major structural change of an ecosystem. And one where I happened to be up there on a weekend and I saw that and I was alarmed. And people thought, oh, the sky's falling in, you know. But we rustled around. I tried to get environmental water allocation that we could actually submerge this stuff before it became established. But during a drought, it's hard to get water. It's like hard to get research funds at the moment. And the rush grew, and we actually monitored the growth rate at 11 millimetres per day. And this grew to about 3.5 metres, and it was going to take a biblical flood to have it submerged if we had any chance of drowning it out. And it changed the big open water body, which used to be dominated by very rich diversity of plants in the wet-dry phase prior to river regulation. It became colonised by a single species, giant rush. The 2005 flood event, or I should say after the drought in 2010, when that broke, it flooded a floodplain that had accumulated so much leaf litter that when it did flood, particularly the December flood, which was twice the size of any previous December floods in recorded history, it basically washed the flood or flushed the floodplain into the river. The organics leached out. We had a blackwater event. It was anoxic. Darren's obviously studied this a lot. You can see the colour of the water. It was black. It looks like sump oil. Fish can't breathe, and the crayfish actually get out of the water, and they try to just keep their tails dipped into the water surface to get enough oxygen in that layer, but the black water just wouldn't let up. And it just goes to show that if we don't look after the floodplains, they can come around and bite us. I mean, we can build up so much of the carbon that it just wasn't burning off. Some of the neat tools over this couple of decades that we've now got that we didn't years ago. I mean, we used to use aerial photos and they were whiz-bang, and infrared shows up the water particularly well. But then we got LiDAR, light detection and ranging, which is basically airborne laser scanning. And we got maps like this. So when you look at that same map, what we're essentially looking at here is the forest devoid of trees. And from a water management side of things, particularly on such a flat landscape as Barmah-Millewa is, this was vitally important. In fact, I've got to say, I felt like being given the cheat sheet of an exam. Because you're looking at this stuff and the answers are there. This is the sort of stuff you're trying to build up in your mind after working out there all your life. And here it was, and it's tremendous. But more than pretty pictures, we can develop hydrological models, which we have done. We can do amazing things with these. We've got a range of thresholds that we know where it goes in the floodplain. We can then overlay it with vegetation types, and we can start to build up a good complex arrangement of information. And this is the very latest type of modelling that we're now doing with the Murray Basin Authority, where we've now got merged vegetation data sets for Barmah and Millewa. I mean, we've got a state border separating the two, so of course they were mapped separately to start with. But so that's a major undertaking, the same currency, and we're able to come up with some good modelling statistics and other information. So the research and monitoring, which I suppose most of us are more interested in. Essentially from a water management side of things, I'm an environmental water manager, and my task is to try to use the best available scientific knowledge and implement it into on-ground actions. And it's exciting. It's also fraught with problems, because if you get it wrong, fingers get pointed at you. If you get it right, then it was nature at its best. What we need though is like a recipe book for each individual species and communities on the floodplain. The autoecology of the species. If we can pull them apart to see how they work, we might be able to reassemble them and supply water or other complementary management activities that best suit that particular species. But it depends on basically every building block of research out there to start to populate these. The Murray Basin Authority, through the Living Murray initiative, come up with a monitoring program that they've funded quite well over the course of the years, from about 2005 onwards. They had three types of monitoring, A, B and O. A monitoring was essentially monitoring types that would be uniform right across all the icon sites. So Barmah, Gunbow, Perracuda, Hatter, Lindsay, Walpolla, etc. Things like satellite imagery of canopies of gum trees, red gums, and then you can look at the understory, you can do correlative type assessments, but that method is employed right across uniformly, and we get these amazing detailed and defensible maps on what the canopy tree health is right across the Murray system. Conversely, B-type monitoring is those that you might undertake. It's funded by the Living Murray program, but it might be icon site specific. So the way they undertake vegetation or fish monitoring in Barmah-Millewa might be different to that's being undertaken in, say, Gunbow or Hatter, but it's still funded as part of the overall program. The O stands for other, and that means that's where we can build in other research or monitoring. It might be university type of research and monitoring, but it can all fit into the broader puzzle. It just means it wasn't being funded by TLM. So this was the layout of what ended up flooding. Don't worry about the detail, but essentially we were looking at birds, fish and vegetation as primary objectives. The O tended to encourage other people to look at reptiles such as turtles and amphibians. So I'll just briefly go through a couple of ones I've been directly involved with. One's the understory vegetation monitoring. This is one that's been funded by TLM. When it first started, in spring 2006, some permanent quadrats were established where I had some previously in 1990. So it was just tremendous to resurvey these areas. Unfortunately, the first 3 years was just complete drought. made vegetation assessments quite easy. But once it rained, just how this system responds it's just staggering. This particular quadrat is a tree culm sedge type quadrat, and big biomass, it's now starting to drop down. On the Moorgrass Plains, this is a site where we had recent giant rush establishment. The drought had actually knocked this stuff, and we'd never seen a drought for so long to see how this species would react. To the point where it was basically degrading in front of our eyes, and it was a tremendous sight. Because although it's a native species, it was behaving as a weed because it was existing in areas that it really shouldn't have. However, it's sort of reincarnating itself and it's popping back. It's a formidable beast, which means that we've really got to have an annual extreme dry followed by good, deep, prolonged floods, and it'll keep it at bay. But unless we have that on a frequent basis, we only need to miss a few years and we've lost the boat. Our waterbird monitorings have been quite exciting. In 2005, we got some of the best waterbird breeding for 40 years, as I was saying, particularly of egrets. Egrets are always that flagship one that we want to get every year, or get when we can, because they breed relatively infrequently. And when they do breed, it takes them so long that just about everything else is bred in between, because they're basically waiting for the ecosystem to breed up the small fish, the frogs, etc., before they go, okay, there's enough food now, we can breed. And it tends to push it into summer, and we don't really like summer watering, so it's a challenge. So the next part of our environmental watering is try to preempt floods or bring it back earlier into winter. And we've got a whole range of strategies, which is the next exciting part of natural resource management on the floodplain. This one's a little egret, quite endangered. Cormorants nest when they can, usually when there's a lot of fish. Unfortunately, we've had some carp explosions, but these are gobbling them up as fast as they can. But our mainstay of colonial waterbird breeders that nest in many years are the ibis, the Australian white ibis and straw-necked ibis, but also royal spoonbills. There's a big spoonbill with a big cape, and they nest out on the giant rush. So what we're doing is in wetlands where we've got giant rush, we are managing them for the rush. We've even supplied environmental water for the health of the rush. But we're doing quite the opposite on the Moorgrass Plains, where we're trying to get rid of the rush. This is essentially some work from David Leslie, had indicated when looking at the number of nests over the height of the river, or the bigger the discharge, found that not necessarily the biggest floods were the most productive for waterbirds. There's a whole range of factors going on, and it might be, external to Barmah-Millewa. And that's where we're tying in with research by Professor Kingsford, Richard. Just recently, we've established some remote cameras in Barmah. We've got 2 in one of the wetlands, and this is where we can just type in onto the internet and we can get images that are up to half an hour old. They just take a static photo and then beam it back to us. But it's tremendous. We can keep an eye on the colonies while they're out there. It's very difficult to get into these wetlands, and it's time consuming. So when we're delivering water, we can just look on the computer and, okay, birds are still sitting there, we deliver water. As opposed to, I wonder if the birds are still there, and we're putting in thousands of dollars of water per day, and it might be going to fresh air because the birds are gone. And that's the other camera. Fish monitoring has been quite a cornerstone of research work in Barmah, certainly since the mid to late 1980s, and it's been more or less continuous. And we're getting some good knowledge on fish that's being undertaken by joint projects with ARI and New South Wales Fisheries. Frog monitoring I've also been involved with. Since we started, we found 3 new species because no one else had really looked all that much. They're not groundbreaking species, a lot of it was just extensions to ranges. But we didn't find the rare ones that we were looking for, and we looked for 6 years. So I don't know why they're missing. I mean, we've got the habitat types. What other factors? But unfortunately, the monitoring is no longer occurring since 2005. So if anyone wants to do a research project, it'd be a good one to look at. Katie Howard and Leah Beasley from ARI have joined up with the Yorta community to look at one of their totem species, which is the long-necked turtle, but also broadshell and the river turtle. During the drought, because so many were dying, they were looking at condition of the turtles, and they were finding that they were underweight, which wasn't surprising. But once we had the return of the flooding, they actually put on a fair bit of weight, which is amazing for a turtle when half it's a shell. So this has been a really good exercise, and Yorta community have been right behind it and had a lot of field days, a lot of ownership with it. They've also got some GPS tags on these things with a really unique little reed switch on the back of the shell, so that when a turtle's underwater, it cuts the signal and saves battery power until the turtle resurfaces, either through nesting or basking, and then it sends the location of it. Fantastic stuff. Once we find out where these things are nesting and the time and all those type of things, that we can then try to protect them. It might be supply of water, or it might be complementary management such as fox control. CSIRO have come in. This is part of the other research monitoring that's not funded directly by TLM, where they're trying to look at the Moragrass Plains and the giant rush interaction in a bit more detail. Here they've got obviously a pool where they can flood small seedlings of giant rush to see how long does it take to drown these things out. Originally I thought maybe a couple of months, but what we're finding is it's taking at least 3.5 months before they actually start to curl up their roots and die. We're also looking at, well, what other conditions conducive to its germination? Again, if we know what it needs to germinate, then we might be able to throw things against it to stop it from germinating when we don't want it. And we've also undertaken some slashing and burning trials within the forest. If we can't elevate the water on the floodplains, then let's reduce the height of the rush. And then we only need a little flood, and we'll try to drown it out. But even that's taxing. This particular site where we tried to put it in, we couldn't get the water in fast enough because the rush was beating us. It was growing that quick. And of course, we're trying to accumulate all the knowledge that's out there into one bibliography, a searchable database. We've got over 600 references, and a lot of it's been directly on Barmah-Millewa. And we've actually got a research conference coming up at the end of April, which is largely booked out, so I'm not really showing you, I guess. Just telling you that you've missed out, bad luck. But this is where we're having 2 days of researchers who have been involved directly in Barmah-Millewa. And we could probably have another 2 days if we had a range of other projects as well that have been just in Barmah-Millewa. So from the adaptive management side of things, basically where does all this leave us? We know what the problems are, or we think we do. We're trying to have the best research and monitoring to learn more about what's going on, and modelling to predict what's going on. Well, this is a pointy end. This is where we tried to actually put it in on the ground. The drought was taxing, but it gave a lot of precedences as well. And I think it also come at a time which is important in history. I'll get into that. This is a permanent waterway that dried up. So issues of permanency in an Australian environment. But this is where we're electrofishing the last remaining pools to try to save some dwarf flat-headed gudgeons and pygmy perch. The other thing that was happening, not only in Barmah-Millewa, it was happening catchment-wide, was red gums were advancing so far down onto the the areas where previously too wet, it was starting to colonise all the creek beds. And as a Catchment Management Authority, we would receive calls from the public to say, oh, my creek out the back's full of red gums, it's going to block it. Come and chop them down. Now, just our CMA alone, the Goulburn Broken, manages over 3,000 kilometres of creeks, and we just can't control red gums in all of that. But at this time, 2007, we actually had a drought employment program where they were employing farmers to undertake natural resource management works for us. So we had basically a group of blokes who were really wanting to get in there and do something. So we trialled some red gum clearing. And we were originally going to do about 1 kilometre, they did 10. And I should say, we'll let the red gums grow first. So this is how they can colonise, for the forest, 20, 30 kilometres of waterways. Drought employment program physically cut, stacked and burnt these things, and they grew back, which of course is what you'd expect, because unless you actually remove the underlying cause for their establishment in the first place, which we didn't, and that is we've got dry creek bed, then it was just right for them to come back. And it just was useful for us to say to landholders outside of the catchment, the forest, that no, we're not clearing the symptoms, but maybe if we can look at broader environmental water use, we can tackle the cause. So as for the rush, we're looking at burning. This is another one with the Indigenous community with traditional ecological burning. We can, they're taking it to task. Parks Vic tend not to undertake these type of burns for fuel reduction. They're difficult to do, but where we've got a well-defined ecological reason and with Indigenous support, they're getting on the burn plans now. So it's going to be a useful one to see how it goes. By the way, the flammability of this stuff's just short of petrol during the dry. We've got no worries with it burning. We undertook some control plots where we did different things, and we're burning bigger areas, and then the idea was we would flood them, but it's pretty hard to flood in a drought when we didn't have water, and they sort of grew back. But not the same, and that's complexities I won't go into now, but it still holds promise. The other interesting thing that's happened in just recent years was the Barmah State Park and State Forest got renamed National Park. Now, cattle grazing was removed prior to the National Park coming in by about 3 years, because during the drought, the cattle were not of good health because there was nothing to eat, so they were removed, but they just haven't been put back. But the National Park will hopefully augur better for the Mora grass, particularly I think if we can get rid of the wild horses. Climate change is going to be another issue. We don't know what that's going to bring for us. Probably not these fellas, but it's management and trying to regain the robustness of the ecosystem health to nurse it through what are some pretty wild rides that we've got coming up in future. And of course, we've got to get water wherever we can. And that was the value of the living Murray, the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. This hopefully will be the next big thing for the wetland environments, because the smaller amounts of water that we're playing with, we've shown it's like urinating in the wind. Now we've potentially got some substantial volumes of water that we can start to dream of recreating these big natural floods within constraints. I mean, we're not sending tidal waves of water down the rivers, but we can at least plug in some key components of the hydrograph that are otherwise missing. So from a Hume Dam type of thing, my vision is sending some environmental water down and flooding some of the floodplains back to some depth that they used to be. I mean, these are the real depths of what's happening on the floodplains. We can start to play with aspects of the hydrograph that we haven't done in the past. It might be preempting floods, it might be building on floods, it might be extending the duration or filling in potholes in the river every time the river drops. It's a whole range of different things we can try with environmental water. At the moment, we're looking at a multi-site watering proposal where we'll potentially deliver big volumes of water through Barmah, recognising most of it gets back into the river and then use it downstream. Another thing that we're looking at is a transparent regulator strategy, whereby come winter, right through spring, we just open up the regulators and let water get into the forest. And anything that's sort of lost to the forest, we debit against our environmental water allocations. And we can try to change mindsets. I mean, have you ever heard the media say the word flood without preempting it with the word worst? I mean, they just can't do it. It'd be great to try to just change it, that mindset, to say, oh, this is the best flooding for X years, depending on what the outcome was. So basically, in conclusion, it's all about trying to use the best research and monitoring and any other information that we've got to try to get the autoecology of the individual species and communities and physico-chem and all those type of functioning of the floodplain, because once we understand it, we might be able to monitor it. Because the stories that we've been told or read from the early explorers and graziers and timber cutters of such a really rich, diverse floodplain environment, I think with environmental water allocations and other complementary management activities, we stand a good chance of getting it back. So, thank you. In terms of the attitudes of landholders with delivering environmental water downstream, we've really got to look at the issue of easements to get that legal right to flood those areas. Otherwise, we're going to be forever stuck with the self-imposed restrictions on how much water we can get down there before we start flooding those areas. So at the moment, that's our attitude, is we're not flooding private land. So with the larger volumes of environmental water, we've got to look at maybe a longer duration, or depending on where we're trying to target, we might be able to deliver water from other systems within those constraints that collectively merge to form the greater. So there's a lot of modelling and other planning work being undertaken at the moment to try to resolve that issue, both on working within the constraints, but also potentially looking at easements in some areas.
There are no obvious benefits to some of those private landholders of being able to get some value added out?
Oh, potentially there is. I mean, part of the fertility of floodplains is based on flooding. Unfortunately, flooding also tends to knock down fences and other infrastructure on those floodplains. It should also be quick to note that the type of floods and easements we're talking about are still on a lower floodplain terrace. They're not going through houses. They're certainly at that low end. But you think about it, there are a lot of infrastructure on those lower parts of the floodplain these days. In terms of water loss to the floodplain environment and percentages that get back to the river, we used to work on a principle of about 30% is lost in the first month when the floodplain's dry, and then 10% is lost after it's been wetted up. Now, every flood's different, and what we've found where we've tried to both model and monitor during flood events is in 2005, the indications were 98% got back, which was pretty high. So we're still working on our 30 and 10 type rule. It still seems pretty well ballpark. We're still undertaking modelling, and with the new models, we're currently doing that right now, working out how much is retained on the floodplain physically. So you fill it up and then you drain it and see how much is left, plus other metrics of evapotranspiration and uptake. So at the moment, we're working on measuring all inflows into the forest, in the river, using the Barmah-Millewa Forest, the complexity of the wetland, it's a giant black box, and then just seeing what comes out the other ends, and then some simple maths. But it doesn't always work that way. When you've got, say, the Goulburn in flood, the Murray River can physically run backwards, and it can do so for a long way, 50 kilometres, right up to the Edwards River offtake. So in that place, it'd be gaining. But no, at the moment we're working on trying to define that, because that will then come into how we debit our environmental water allocations. In terms of the next big problems for Barmah-Millewa, instead of reactive to current problems, first and foremost, it's trying to stop new introductions of pest, plant and animals. We've recently done surveys for things like a bomba to make sure it's not within the forest environment. The Commonwealth CFOC funding, Caring for Our Country, has invested substantial funds of money to try to squash down pest, plant and animals, so that the duty of care of the land manager, which is Parks Vic, can then keep them at that suppressed level. It's also just trying to reinvigorate ecosystem health. So at the moment, we tend to concentrate a little bit on water birds and things like moora grass plains and, flagships, I guess. But underlying that is another premise that it's bringing together a whole range of ecosystem, both in terms of species and services along with it. But once we know more, then we might be able to target it. So at the moment, with small amounts of environmental water, we've basically had to water our favourite tree in a way with the tap. But when we're getting a bigger and bigger bucket, it means we can start to spread that load and start to get other targets that we've just haven't been able to dream about previously. So talking about successional planning and knowledge. I mean, I'm conscious I'm but one person in a room also holding a wealth of knowledge to that particular ecosystem or even broader ecosystems. So it's really not depending on one person, and the type of knowledge I'm picking up has been because of predecessors. Sure, I've added to it, and I think there is something to be gained from being directly involved with anything. I quite enjoy the research, the monitoring and closing that adaptive loop, because I don't really need to convince someone else and hope they pick it up. I can write it down and then try to get those things approved. But there's a lot of checks and balances involved with that. And I'm relying on that bibliography of 600 references and some gut instincts too, I guess. Plus, I'm part of a team. What I'm talking about is things I've been directly involved with, but I could have easily been up here for an extra 6 hours talking about the range of other projects which are being undertaken, which develop our adaptive management that's going on. In terms of resource reductions, basically I probably wouldn't be working there if the funds get cut. And that's an omnipresent issue. Every year it seems to be, am I still going to be here next year? And I think, every time we have a restructure, it gives you a stomach ulcer you probably don't need. But if I was to disappear, I would hope that the legacy is things that I've written, and to add to the throng of literature. I've got a little bit in proper published literature, usually with co-authors, or my ideas have spurred some ideas. Otherwise, it's in grey literature. And part of the reason of actually assembling that bibliography, because it wasn't a funded deliverable, was because I'm really conscious that in the public service, you tend to get people coming through about every 3 to 5 years, and then they're new. So the next person that comes in will have a fresh bunch of ideas, but it won't be, hopefully, repeating any mistakes that I've got a wealth of knowledge to learn from.